It was the bells that drew me back that morning, faint, uneven, as though struck by an uncertain hand. Oxford has its share of music, but none so persistent as its melancholy. You can stand by a gate or beneath an archway and hear a single note hang longer than it should, echoing against stone that remembers too much. That was how the case began, though of course I didn't know it then. I was simply standing by the canal, thinking about nothing in particular, which is when most things of importance seem to happen to me. The term was ending. Students had begun to scatter, leaving behind only the debris of effort paper cups, exam timetables, and the occasional bicycle with a flat tire. I was nursing the residue of a night spent with too much whiskey and too little sense of purpose when Lewis appeared, awkwardly holding his hat as if it had betrayed him. He told me about the death at St. Anselm's, a fellow found dead in his rooms, door locked, glass of wine beside him. The college doctor was calling it natural. Lewis, poor man, was already hoping it was. The name Latham meant something. I had seen it on the spine of an old translation of Horace, in the library of Balliol, perhaps. I told Lewis as much, and he shrugged in that way that says he neither knows nor cares, provided someone else will write the report. Still he drove me there through the drizzle that Oxford wears so well, the kind that makes every pavement shimmer and every memory ache. The porter who met us was of the old type, convinced that no crime could happen within the walls of a proper college. He kept saying it was a peaceful death, as though repetition could make it true. The corridor outside Latham's rooms smelled faintly of varnish and burnt dust from the radiators. The scout had placed a vase of daffodils outside, a gesture of respect or perhaps embarrassment. Inside the air was cold, the curtains are half drawn. On the desk is the usual litter of a life too long in academia, letters unanswered, books open on conflicting subjects, and a single crossword from the Times unfinished. I glanced at it half-idly until the clue near the bottom caught my eye. Ends in silence. 6 letters. The answer space remained blank. It was the kind of clue that would have amused me once. It might still have, if not for the body beside it. Dr. Latham sat slumped forward, his spectacles folded neatly on the table. No sign of struggle, no sign of fear. A gentle exit, the college nurse would later call it. Yet the window was ajar, letting in the morning damp, and there was no reason for it to be. People do not open windows when they are ready to die. They close them as if to keep the world out. Lewis busied himself with the doctor, who was speaking of arrhythmia and stress. I found myself tracing the edge of a glass of claret, untouched, perfectly placed on a coaster. A man who lives alone does not use a coaster for himself. The detail stuck, not proof, not even suspicion, just a small betrayal of neatness that didn't belong to the dead. In the grate, ashes. I stirred them with a pen. Paper burns differently when folded and burned in strips. Someone had torn something before lighting it. A letter, perhaps. The edges curled inward like gilt. I pocketed a corner of it, and a single word survived again. When I stepped outside, the bells began once more, not the chapel this time, but the city beyond, calling students to evensong or lovers to part. The sound came softer through rain. Lewis asked if I believed it was suicide. I said it might be, though not the kind that ends with peace. He frowned, puzzled as ever by ambiguity. Back at the lodge, the porter offered me the register of visitors. It was routine, yet even in routine lies revelation. I noticed one name crossed out, replaced by another written faintly over it. The handwriting was feminine, controlled, and hurried all at once. I traced it with my finger, feeling the indentation. Whoever she was, she hadn't wanted to be remembered, but hadn't quite managed to vanish either. That evening, I stood under the great elm in the quad and watched the candle still burning in Latham's window. Someone had forgotten to snuff it, or someone wanted the illusion of presence, the same small mercy one grants to the dead when one cannot yet bear their absence. Oxford has a way of dressing death in propriety. Bells, gowns, a few whispered Latin phrases. Yet beneath it all there is always the same silence, a silence that hums if you listen long enough, like the aftermath of a chord unresolved. And as the bells faded into that silence, I found myself wondering, not for the first time, whether it was truly the end of something or merely the beginning. It is remarkable how quickly a man's life becomes an inventory. I remember thinking that as I stood beside the desk where Dr. Pembroke's body had been discovered, on a desk so meticulously arranged that it seemed to protest against the disorder of death. The port wine glass stood like a punctuation mark, red against the pale varnish. His pen lay neatly across a page of half-finished correspondence, and beside it a book of verse with one corner turned down. Everything in that small room suggested a man still alive, still mid-thought. Everything but him. Lewis was speaking to the college doctor, but I barely listened. There is a hum to a death scene, a frequency of stillness that no conversation can quite pierce. Pembroke had been, they told me, a man of classical temperament, precise, solitary, given to quoting Horace at inappropriate moments, the sort of Don Oxford produces by habit and then quietly forgets. Yet as I looked around, I had the sense of a recent disturbance, a rearrangement that was too self-conscious. The curtains were drawn halfway, the window latch smeared faintly, the fire set but unlit. It felt as if someone had tidied not for life, but for remembrance. I asked Lewis to fetch the porter's logbook. He frowned. The small rebellion of a man who knows this will mean another hour in the rain. Still he went. I remained and read the letter on the desk. It began formally, "My dear Margaret," and ended in confusion. The last sentence trailed into an ellipse that no amount of imagination could complete. What he meant to say, or could not bear to say, was lost in that fading line. I folded it carefully and slipped it back where it had been. It seemed wrong to let unfinished words stray from their dead author. Outside, the chapel bell began to toll the quarter hour, a sound that always makes me think of endings rather than beginnings. The college walls, mottled with damp, reflected a dull light through the window. I noticed a faint smear on the sill, as though someone had steadied themselves there, perhaps to watch the quad below. The drizzle had turned to rain by then, and I imagined Pembroke, or someone else, standing there late last night, eyes following the slow procession of umbrellas crossing the courtyard. Lewis returned with the logbook, smelling faintly of pipe smoke and wet wool. Only 3 visitors were recorded for the previous evening. One name had been scratched through almost violently, leaving only the faint impression of the original ink. Beneath it, a second name was written the same hand, different pressure. The correction felt deliberate, guilty even. I traced the indentation with my thumb and said nothing. Lewis asked what I saw. I told him I wasn't sure, which was true, though not entirely. The bursar, a pale man who seemed perpetually cold, arrived to offer his condolences to no one in particular. He spoke in the apologetic tone reserved for administrative inconvenience. Pembroke had resigned his fellowship some years earlier after what the bursar called an unfortunate misunderstanding with an undergraduate. He said it quickly, as one might say appendicitis. I asked if Pembroke had been in ill health. The bursar blinked, then confessed that he hadn't seen the man for weeks. He preferred isolation, he said. I nearly smiled at the thought, as if solitude were an eccentricity, not the inevitable companion of certain minds. There was a note pinned above the fireplace, a line from T.S. Eliot, copied in Pembroke's hand. After the end of all our exploring, we shall arrive where we started. The ink had bled slightly, as if written with a shaking hand. I stood there longer than I should have, thinking of that circle, that cruel promise of understanding too late. Lewis was watching me. He said quietly that it looked like suicide. Perhaps it did. But suicide rarely arranges its props with such aesthetic care. As we left, I paused at the door. Something on the floor caught my eye, a thin trail of crimson across the carpet, no thicker than a thread, not blood, as Lewis would later insist, but wine, a droplet fallen from a refilled glass, except there was only one glass on the table, and it was full. I made a note of that, though not out loud. Some details prefer silence. Outside, the porter locked the door behind us with the solemnity of a priest sealing a crypt. Rain pattered on the worn stone steps, each drop a faint percussion to thought. Lewis muttered that he didn't envy me the paperwork. I told him he wouldn't have to. This one, I said, would not stay tidy. And as we walked back through the quad, I heard the bells again, slower now, deeper, as if marking the distance between what is known and what must be learned. I remember thinking that Oxford, in its way, keeps better company with the dead than with the living. Pembroke would not be the first to discover that. The morning after Pembroke's death arrived with a deceptive brightness, a rare intrusion of sunlight over Oxford, glinting across the domes and spires as though the city were trying to look innocent. I've always distrusted beautiful mornings after death because they make the world seem complicit in forgetting. Lewis drove us back to St. Fridswide's, the car moving through narrow lanes, still slick from the night's rain. The wipers made that steady rhythm I've come to associate with unfinished thoughts. The porters were in a state of hushed excitement when we arrived. Oxford has its own method of gossip, quiet, scholarly, and cruel. Everyone already knew of Pembroke's passing, though the details were uncertain, distorted by repetition and fear of scandal. The word heart failure was repeated like a charm, as if saying it enough times might keep the truth tidy. I lit a cigarette and watched the smoke rise toward the archway ceiling. It curled like a question no one wished to answer. Lewis had gone to fetch the guest book I'd asked to see the previous night. I remained by the lodge window, observing the quadrangle, an enclosed perfection of lawns and shadows. Students were packing boxes into taxis. Their laughter felt wrong here, a reminder that the living seldom pause for the dead. And yet I could almost sense Pembroke's presence among them, standing unseen beneath the cloisters, listening to their carelessness. A man who had once ruled over their essays and now lingered only in the faint indentation his chair left in the study carpet. Lewis returned, the book open in his hand. One name had been entered for the evening before Pembroke's death, Helena Fane. I knew it before he said it aloud. There are certain name S that sound rehearsed in the mind before they ever reach the ear. Fane is a novelist, once Pembroke's most gifted pupil, and perhaps something more. I recalled her debut years ago, a volume of short stories praised for their moral clarity, though I had found them too neat by half. It struck me as ironic that a woman who wrote so tidily about guilt should find herself returned to its source. The college bursar confirmed she had been staying nearby for a literary event. I asked whether Pembroke had attended, and the bursar hesitated, saying only that Pembroke was fond of her company in his way. The tone of those last three words was unmistakable, a small dagger wrapped in formality. Oxford's cruelty again, this time wearing the gown of discretion. When I called upon Helena later that afternoon at Randolph, she greeted me not with grief, but with a composure that made me uneasy, the sort of calm that has already rehearsed its defence. She spoke of Pembroke as one might of a distant cousin, fondly but without depth. Yet I noticed her hands trembled when she poured the tea, and her eyes lingered on the steam rising from the cup as though she saw something in it the rest of us could not. She said they had not met in years, that his death was a strange coincidence following her return. Coincidence, I've learned, is a word the guilty use when language fails them. On the table beside her lay a new edition of her novel, inscribed with a dedication for A.P., who taught me that silence can wound. The initials required no translation. I asked whether she had ever written to him recently. She smiled faintly as if the question were impertinent in its simplicity. "Writers and teachers communicate through memory," she said. "We hardly need letters." It was beautifully phrased, which made it feel rehearsed. Leaving the hotel, I caught sight of a man waiting by the concierge's desk, early middle-aged, well-dressed, but with that particular tension of someone who has been kept waiting too long for something that will never arrive. His eyes flicked toward Helena's door as I passed. I made a note of him, though I did not yet know his name. Later, I would learn he was Pembroke's former colleague, Adrian Keene. At that moment, I only registered his stillness, the stillness of a man carrying too much unfinished speech. That evening, Lewis and I walked the narrow path along the river. The mist was rising, swallowing the willows one by one. He said he thought the novelist seemed decent enough. I told him decency was rarely a guarantee of innocence. He muttered something about cynicism, but I barely heard. My thoughts had turned to the erased name in the visitor's book, the one written before Helena's. It had been crossed out too perfectly, as if someone had wanted to remove not just a name, but a presence. I returned to Pembroke's rooms before dusk. The candle had burned down, leaving a hollow rim of wax around the holder. The window was open again, though I knew Lewis had closed it that morning. The faint scent of perfume hung in the air, floral but faintly medicinal. On the desk, the crossword remained untouched, but I noticed something new. The word echo penciled lightly in the margin, where the clue ends in silence had once been. It might have been Pembroke's hand, though I doubted it. The letters were too delicate, too deliberate, a woman's hand perhaps. I stood there in the fading light, the river murmuring beyond the college wall, and realized how the past never really leaves us. It waits patiently, articulate, and always ready to return, like an old visitor who knows the way without asking for directions. There are meetings that feel less like encounters than collisions of unfinished sentences. My visit to Helena Fane was one such moment, though I did not understand that fully until much later. The afternoon light through her hotel window fell like diluted gold across the table, picking out a scatter of cigarette ends and a glass of sherry untouched but half evaporated. She was dressed in the careful disorder of the self-possessed, a cardigan draped across her shoulders, hair loosely tied as though she had been caught between recollection and performance. She spoke first, asking whether I believed in coincidence. I said I didn't trust it. It behaves too conveniently for the guilty. She smiled, not in amusement, but recognition. It was the smile of a woman accustomed to hearing herself described. She said that Pembroke had been kind once, that his lectures were full of dust and brilliance, that he made people feel cleverer than they were. I asked when she last saw him, and she hesitated just long enough to betray thought. "Years," she said at last, "years and lives ago." I let it rest, though I knew from her eyes the slightest shift toward the window that it was not true. Lies rarely shout, they drift toward escape. A breeze caught the edge of the curtain then, drawing in the scent of the city-damp stone, exhaust, distant lilies from some florist's doorway. For a moment I was aware of the church bells carrying faintly from St. Giles. Time in Oxford is always measured by bells and gilt. I asked about her new book, and she seemed almost relieved. Writers are happiest when discussing inventions. It's about absolution, she said, the price of being forgiven. I asked her whether she believed such a thing could be bought. She didn't answer directly. Everyone pays in some form, she said, even those who pretend otherwise. I could have said the same of her. Afterwards, I walked to North Parade to see Margaret Pembroke, the widow. If Helena represented the burnished illusion of memory, Margaret was its residue. She opened the door herself, her expression neither welcoming nor defensive, simply resigned. The house smelled of damp wool and lavender polish. Grief often lingers as scent long after tears have stopped being fashionable. She led me to a small sitting room, immaculate but airless, where framed photographs lined the mantel like a tribunal. None of Pembroke in recent years. Only the younger man, lean, idealistic, the sort who believed thought could defend against decay. She poured tea with mechanical grace. It struck me that she had done so for decades, first as a habit, then as a ceremony, now as survival. I asked whether she had seen her husband the day before he died. He came for lunch, she said. He spoke little, but then he always spoke little. She paused. He asked for forgiveness, though he didn't say what for. I asked what she replied. She looked at me with the faintest trace of pity. I told him he already had it. That was perhaps my cruelty. A clock on the sideboard ticked with unnatural precision. It was the only sound in the room besides the whisper of the rain beginning again against the windows. She told me they had lived separately for 5 years amicably, if one can use such a word, about the slow erosion of affection. He wanted solitude, she said, and I wanted to stop pretending it wasn't solitude he wanted. I believed her. There was no bitterness, only exhaustion. I asked whether she knew of Helena Fane. The teacup paused midway to her lips, just briefly, but enough. The writer, she said. I remember her. She sent him a book once. He threw it away. I left soon after. The air outside felt sharper, almost metallic, as if the rain were cleansing something the college could not. I walked past the shop fronts toward the river, thinking of the 2 women, one gilded by memory, the other dulled by it, and of the man who had somehow managed to belong fully to neither. They had both spoken of forgiveness in different tongues. It was that repetition that stayed with me, as repetitions often do. I recalled the crossword from Pembroke's desk, and the unfinished clue ends in silence. Forgiveness might have been his silence, or perhaps its cause. Back in my flat that evening, I stared at the scrap of burned paper I'd taken from his grate. The word again is still legible, faintly underlined by ash. I remembered something Helena had said about everyone paying. The word again seemed less a plea than a confession. I poured myself a whiskey, the good one, and listened to the rain thinning to a whisper. Lewis had called earlier, his voice weary but curious. He asked what I made of the novelist and the widow. I told him they were 2 halves of a riddle, one who had loved too early, the other too late. He laughed softly, and I envied his simplicity. Before turning in, I found myself sketching the faint outline of a triangle in my notebook, not geometric, but human. Pembroke, Helena, Margaret. 3 points connected by silence, each reflecting a version of the other. Somewhere in that symmetry lay the truth, though it refused to declare itself. Cases like these rarely shout, they hum, low and persistent, beneath the clatter of daily life. I closed the notebook and let the sound of the rain fold itself around me like a tired thought. Oxford slept, or pretended to. While the bells marked another hour, none of us would quite recover. The morning began with an envelope that no longer existed. It had been posted. Certainly the porter remembered Pembroke at the counter, standing with that careful posture of a man sending away more than paper, but it had never reached its destination. The absence of it lingered like perfume in an empty room. Lewis called it a small detail, but he has never understood that smallness is often where guilt hides best. We walked together through the college quad, our breath rising faintly in the chill. The air smelt of coal and wet ivy. Somewhere a gardener was raking leaves, the sound rhythmic, almost ecclesiastical. I remember thinking that if Pembroke had chosen his own death, he had done so in a world still insistently alive. The porter, summoned from his warm booth, produced the ledger of outgoing mail, the sort of volume that treats memory as bureaucracy. The entry for that night was neat, untroubled letter private. No address, no initials. A tiny omission that felt intentional. In Pembroke's rooms, the traces of him had already begun to vanish. The candle stubs had been removed, the desk polished by an overzealous scout. Only the faint circle of dust remained where his glass had stood. I sat in the chair he had last occupied and tried, briefly, to think as if he might have a futile exercise, since no one ever truly inherits another man's despair. Lewis busied himself with the drawers, producing the kind of clutter that passes for biography, lecture notes, invoices, a photograph of a much younger Helena Fane, smiling as though unaware she would ever be studied for motive. It was Lewis who found the torn envelope, though he thought little of it. A scrap lodged under the carpet edge, the sort of thing anyone else would sweep away. Only the corner survived, faintly perfumed, the faintest trace of lilac. The handwriting, gracefully, deliberately, was not Pembroke's. There was no address, only a remnant of a wax seal, crimson cracked through its centre. I pocketed it without comment. I had already begun to suspect that whatever was written within had been both confession and plea, and that someone had decided neither should survive. That afternoon, I visited the postmaster, an elderly man who seemed carved from the same oak as his counter. He remembered Pembroke well. Most people remembered Pembroke, said he had stood there for some time, hesitating as though uncertain of his own intention. He looked like a man rehearsing, the postmaster said. Rehearsing for what, he couldn't say. When Pembroke finally dropped the envelope into the slot, his hand lingered there, unwilling to let it go. There are gestures more revealing than words, and that one felt like farewell. On my way back, the clouds broke briefly, letting in a sun too fragile to matter. I stopped outside a bookshop window where a display of Helena Fane's novels stood in perfect formation. Their spines gleamed symmetry and always did appeal to her. I wondered if she had received the letter or destroyed it. Both options implied guilt. Only the innocent misplace correspondence, and the guilty erase it. Later, I visited the college librarian. Margaret Vale met me with her usual restraint, that polished calm of the long-schooled heart. She said Pembroke had been unwell, distracted. He had withdrawn several volumes recently, one, curiously, on cryptographic verse. When I asked if she had seen him on the night of his death, she hesitated just long enough to betray memory. No, she said at last. I was cataloguing, but her fingers tightened around the edge of the desk. I saw the smallest pulse of fear, not of me, but of what silence might cost. Before leaving, I turned to the register of borrowed books. His name was there, written twice. The second entry struck me as odd, same volume, same date, same signature. A duplication that made no sense unless someone had tried to conceal the first. The ink of the later entry was fresher, the pressure heavier. Someone had been rewriting his history by hand. That evening, I returned to my flat and laid the torn envelope fragment beside the crossword page I'd kept. The clue ends in silence still mocked me. Pembroke had written half the word echo before stopping. Perhaps he had meant to complete it. Perhaps someone had stopped him. I poured a whiskey and thought about how letters, once sent, become irreversible, and how words, once written, can be damned or redeemed depending on who reads them. The rain started again, steady, methodical, the sound of Oxford washing its hands of the day. I imagined the missing letter somewhere between here and nowhere, a lost testament drifting among circulars and unpaid bills. Maybe it had reached its reader and been burned at once. Maybe it had never left the porter's box. I would never know. What I did know was that Pembroke's death was less an ending than a redirection. A message half delivered, half concealed, addressed, perhaps, to himself. When I finally switched off the light, I thought I heard the rustle of paper not outside, but within my mind the soft turning of a page that wasn't quite finished. Some silences, I've learned, do not end. They simply change addresses. It was the misquotation that troubled me. Not its sentiment. People misquote poets all the time, usually to improve upon them, but the fact that Pembroke of all men would have done so. The note above his fireplace had seemed at first a commonplace indulgence. After the silence, there was peace. But Eliot had never written that line. He had written, after the silence, only death. The substitution, so quiet, so deliberate, lingered in my mind like a discordant chord at the end of an unfinished symphony. Lewis and I were walking across the High that morning, a steady drizzle falling with the indifference of routine. He spoke of evidence, timelines, and opportunity. I let him. It was easier to let the noise of practicality surround me while my thoughts pursued quieter paths. Pembroke's note was not an aphorism, it was an argument. He had rewritten a poet to contradict the inevitable the way a man might attempt to edit fate. We reached the chapel where the organist, a timid man named Reeves, was practicing. The air was thick with incense and damp wood. The first notes drifted through the nave, hesitant but yearning toward harmony. Reeves stopped when he saw us and nodded nervously, his fingers still resting on the keys as though afraid to let them go. I asked whether he had known Pembroke well. He looked surprised at the question, then said that the late doctor had often come to listen to rehearsals. Not for the music, he said, but for the silences between the notes. I told him that was precisely what most people missed. He hesitated before telling me something else. Pembroke had once corrected him on a hymn quotation, months ago, after Evensong. "It isn't mercy that endures forever," Pembroke had said. "It's endurance that proves mercy." Reeves had laughed, thinking it a jest, but the words had stayed with him. So had the tone. I wrote it down later, that quiet reversal. Pembroke had been rewriting scripture the way he rewrote Eliot, as if testing whether language could soften absolutes. Outside, the rain had turned heavier. Lewis complained about his shoes. I asked him to stop at the Bodleian. Inside, the librarian produced a small ledger of borrowed texts. Pembroke's last entry was a curious volume of correspondence between T.S. Eliot and a forgotten scholar of theology. The return date had passed unnoticed. I requested the librarian's indulgence to see if the book had been returned unofficially. It had. Yet the handwriting in the register beside Pembroke's name was different from his usual neat script. The curve of the P was wrong. Someone else had completed the transaction for him. Lewis dismissed it as trivial. I didn't. Oxford has always believed too much in its own neatness. The falsified hand was the opposite of an accident. It was a gesture of control. I imagined a woman's hand, though I couldn't have said why. Perhaps because the ink trailed slightly upward, a trace of elegance unnecessary for deceit. By late afternoon, the city had blurred into greys. I returned alone to Pembroke's rooms, the curtains hung motionless, their folds holding the faint scent of tobacco and loneliness. On his desk, the same arrangement books aligned, ashtray emptied, crossword half-finished. But I noticed something new. A faint smear on the blotter, the impression of a fountain pen drawn diagonally across its surface. Beneath it, the indentation of a phrase written and then removed. I took a sheet of paper, laid it across, and shaded lightly with graphite. The words emerged slowly like a ghost summoned unwillingly to forgive the sound of the organ. Not a confession, a sentence of apology. I sat there a long while, trying to hear it aloud, to imagine to whom it had been meant. Helena Fane? Margaret Pembroke? Or perhaps to himself, the man who had rewritten poets and prayers to escape their verdicts. When I finally rose, I glanced again at the quotation on the wall. The ink had faded in patches, as though touched often, perhaps by a hand, seeking reassurance. I thought of Eliot's true line, "Only death," and wondered whether Pembroke's defiance had been courage or denial. Lewis arrived, dripping rainwater on the carpet, to report that the medical examiner had confirmed traces of a sedative in Pembroke's bloodstream. Enough to dull the edges, not enough to end anything. I said nothing. There are deaths that do not require poison to succeed. Later, back in my flat, I poured a whiskey and looked out at the city. The bells of Magdalen drifted faintly through the rain, their echoes dissolving into mist. I opened my notebook, drew a small arrow between Pembroke's misquote and the forged library entry, and circled both. A man who alters a poet's line, and a woman who alters a register, two acts of quiet correction, born perhaps of the same need to rewrite what should never have been written. As the whiskey thinned in the glass, I recalled something Reeves had said about silence being the truest part of music. Perhaps he was right. In the end, the truth of Pembroke's death, like his borrowed verse, lay not in what was written, but in what had been carefully, almost lovingly, erased. It was late when the boy came. Not a boy, really 18, perhaps 19, but carrying that tremor of youth that makes even guilt look fragile. Lewis had found him waiting by the porter's gate, soaked to the bone and unwilling to come inside. He said he had information. They always do at that age, information, as though truth was something to be traded before curfew. He sat opposite me in the small college office, his hands gripping his cap, like a man on the edge of confession and cowardice. His name was Daniel Prothero, a chorister from the chapel. He had been paid, he said, to deliver a message between Dr. Pembroke and a woman. The woman's name he didn't know. He described her as refined, which in Oxford means everything and nothing. She had waited near the cloisters one night, her face hidden beneath a scarf. The boy thought she'd been crying. She had pressed a letter into his hand and told him to give it directly to Pembroke after evensong. He'd done so. The next morning, Pembroke was dead. Lewis asked the usual questions: when, where, what time, the practicalities that lend an illusion of progress. I watched the boy instead. His voice faltered at the mention of the chapel, as though the place itself carried weight. I asked what he'd heard that night. He hesitated, then said he'd heard voices after delivering the letter. Pembroke's room was lit, the windows slightly open. He had walked past on his way out, he said, and heard the sound of the organ from inside, just a few notes, then silence. He thought it strange, as the organ could only be played from the chapel, not Pembroke's study. It was that impossible, unprovable detail that caught me. Not the boy's trembling honesty, but the sound that could not have existed. The mind misremembers, I told myself. Memory is not a recording, it's a confession in disguise. Still, I wrote it down. He said there was one more thing. When he'd returned the next morning, out of curiosity or guilt, he'd seen the same woman again. She had been standing near the side door of the chapel, dressed in black this time, though her scarf remained the same. She dropped something, a key, perhaps, and vanished into the crowd of morning service goers before he could speak. He'd picked it up. From his pocket he produced it now, wrapped in a handkerchief like contraband. The metal was old, engraved faintly with the number 12. I knew at once it belonged to the college archives in the restricted collection. Pembroke had once had access. No one had since. Lewis was already speaking to the boy, praising his courage, promising discretion. I said little. There are times when silence is more than reassurance. The boy seemed grateful for it. He rose, shivering, and asked if he might go to confession, as though we were priests and this room a vestry. I told him to go home. He thanked me, though I had given him nothing. After he left, Lewis looked at me expectantly. He asked whether I believed him. I said belief was a luxury and we couldn't afford it. Still I turned the key in my hand. The brass was warm, as if the boy's fear had left a trace. Number 12. The section of personal correspondence, letters and wills, sealed by college statute. Pembroke's own papers had been transferred there years ago. I remembered a clerk once saying they contained something literary, an unfinished manuscript perhaps. Oxford has always preferred its scandals bound and indexed. We went there that evening, long after the porters had finished their rounds. The corridor smelled of polish and faint mildew, the air heavy with the patience of centuries. My torch caught the dust suspended in the beam like slow snow. The door to section 12 yielded easily. Inside, rows of labelled boxes slept beneath layers of time. We found Pembroke's immediately 3 narrow files tied with string. The top one bore his handwriting, the same careful slant I'd seen on the misquoted Eliot. It contained, among the expected letters and notes, one sheet of music, the opening bars of a hymn, incomplete, its title scratched out. Beneath the notation, written faintly in pencil, a single phrase: "She will forgive me when the silence ends." Lewis asked what it meant. I told him I wasn't sure. It felt less like an explanation than a resignation. He frowned at the score, said it looked like a child's attempt at composition. But I recognized something older, sadder, the way the notes faltered halfway, never resolving into cadence. Pembroke had been trying to rewrite harmony the same way he had rewritten Eliot, hoping that by changing the ending he might delay the truth. When we left, the night had thickened to mist. Across the quad, the chapel windows glowed faintly, and from within came the sound of a rehearsal, a hymn rising, unsteady, as though echoing from some earlier century. I thought of the boy's confession, the organ that played where it should not, the voice that faltered in silence. Lewis asked whether I believed in coincidence. I told him no. In Oxford, nothing is ever a coincidence, only repetition disguised as memory. And yet, as the hymn swelled behind the stone walls, I felt absurdly that Pembroke had been right about one thing. After the silence, something remains, not peace, not death, only the echo. It was Lewis who found the answer first, or thought he had. He arrived at my flat just after dusk, damp and flushed from the short walk, holding the certainty of a man who wanted the case over. He told me the widow had confessed, though not in so many words. She had wept in a way that suggested ownership of guilt, and guilt, as I have often found, is a performance we are too willing to applaud. She had poured the sherry, he said. Pembroke had drunk it. The flask from her house was missing. He spoke as if listing ingredients for a recipe, sure of the meal before tasting it. I poured him a whiskey instead, mostly to slow the momentum. It would have been neat, I'll admit too neat. Margaret Pembroke, the dutiful wife, cast aside for years, seeing her husband's renewed affection for Helena Fane and choosing the quietest revenge. A woman who had once practiced patience learning, at last, the precision of ending. I even wrote it down on the corner of my notes: motive, means, opportunity. The trinity of convenience. It fits like a crossword answer that seems perfect until the next clue refuses to align. There was one square still unfilled with music. I returned alone to St. Frida's Wides that night. The rain had begun again, that steady, resigned kind that Oxford wears without protest. The porter looked up from his newspaper and nodded, offering the same dull sympathy reserved for both constables and undertakers. I climbed the stairs to Pembroke's room, each step echoing faintly through the corridor. Death leaves its sound behind long after the scent fades. The desk was as we'd left it, papers reordered by a hand eager to appear respectful, which always means clumsy. I sat, staring at the half-finished crossword, the last clue still empty. 6 letters. Ends in silence. Lewis had suggested murder. I had laughed at the irony, though I wasn't laughing now. I let my eyes drift across the room, tracing its geometry. The unlit lamp, the ashtray turned slightly outward, the glass of sherry unmarked by lips. A suicide, the college called it. A poisoning, the constabulary believed. But what I saw was an arrangement, a tableau curated to suggest comprehension. Pembroke, that old stylist of the intellect, would have appreciated the aesthetic. I noticed a detail I had missed before. The book of verse beside the bed, the waste land, of course, had been moved since our first visit. I turned to the marked page. The lines were underlined faintly in pencil. Who is the third who always walks beside you? I ran my thumb along the margin. In the corner, barely visible, an initial M, not Margaret's hand. The line trembled, written by someone unused to writing secrets, a woman perhaps, but younger. My thoughts returned to the nurse, that quiet, watchful woman who had been at Pembroke's bedside before. She had spoken once, nervously, of his kindness, of gratitude, never love. And yet gratitude in lonely people becomes its own form of affection. I left the college and crossed to the chapel. Inside, the organ pipes gleamed faintly in the low light. Reeves, the organist, was there again, his back bent in reverence over the keys. He looked up when I entered, startled, as though the dead themselves had returned for evensong. He said he hadn't expected anyone. I told him neither had Pembroke. The words sounded harsher than I intended. I asked him to play the hymn he had been rehearsing the night before Pembroke's death. He began slow, uncertain, and I recognized the melody at once. The same as on the sheet we had found in the archives, Pembroke's unfinished composition. But Reeves was altering the rhythm, softening the pauses, adding grace notes that were not written. I stopped him, asked where he'd learned that version. He looked confused, said it was how the nurse had hummed it to him once while tending to Pembroke's sick room. It was enough. The false confession, the tidy explanation Lewis wanted, all of it collapsed in that moment. Pembroke had written a song of apology. The nurse had finished it for him, just as she had finished his life. Not in hatred, but in misguided devotion. I almost envied her courage, the cruelty of mercy. When I returned to my room, Lewis was asleep in the chair, the case file open on his chest like a blanket. I didn't wake him. Instead, I stood by the window listening to the rain's uneven rhythm. The false solution would hold for a few days, yet long enough for paperwork, for press, for peace. Truth, I have found, rarely needs to be believed to exist. It survives in the silences like a refrain only the guilty hear. I poured myself a final drink and looked again at my notes. ends in silence. 6 letters. It came to me then, quiet and cruel regret. I wrote it in carefully, folded the page, and left the puzzle unfinished. I went to her room that evening, not because I expected revelation, but because something in the silence between her sentences had begun to disturb me. Her name was Evelyn Marsh, the college nurse, a woman of indeterminate age whose voice still carried the soft precision of someone who has spent her life telling others that everything will be all right. Her lodgings stood in a narrow lane behind the chapel, where the light always seems to fall too early, as if in deference to discretion. She opened the door before I knocked. I suppose she had seen me from the window. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of disinfectant and lilies, a combination that suggested she had learned to dress death in civility. The room was neat, almost punishingly so, every book aligned, every chair facing its proper corner. She asked if I wanted tea. I said no. She made it anyway. It arrived weak, precise, inevitable. She began with small practical details of Pembroke's health, his prescriptions, his moods. She spoke as though reading a case note aloud. I let her talk until her voice steadied. Then I asked whether she had been close to him. She looked up sharply, as though surprised that the word itself still existed. "He saved me once," she said. Not from illness, I gathered, but from dismissal. A theft of morphine, covered over, forgotten in exchange for loyalty. Gratitude is a dangerous debt that accumulates interest long after payment. She told me she had visited him on the night of his death. He had been writing, she said, a letter or perhaps a confession. His hand trembled. He had spoken of the past, of mistakes that must finally come clean. She hadn't understood, or hadn't wished to. He asked her to fetch a book from the chapel, one he had lent to the organist. She went. When she returned, he was gone, not in body, but in spirit. I asked whether she had seen the letter. She hesitated. "It wasn't finished," she said. "I couldn't let them read it like that." It was a confession disguised as protection. She thought she had done a kindness, I think. Destroyed the final words of a man who no longer knew how to live among them. I asked whether she had written anything herself in that room. She shook her head, but her fingers moved unconsciously toward the writing desk beside her, a small, practical motion of ownership. I followed her gaze and saw on the table an organ recital program. The date was wrong, the night after Pembroke's death. She had played that evening, she said quietly. The hymn he had loved most. I told her I knew the line, after the silence, "There is peace." Her eyes flickered then, a faint recoil. She said she had written it for him once, as a note to cheer him up. He thought it was Eliot, she said. He liked it better that way. She smiled faintly, almost apologetically, as if falsehood were a mercy. Outside, the rain had started again. It made a soft patter against the glass, the sound of thought returning. I asked why she had gone back to his room the next morning. She said she wanted to make things neat, to straighten what life had left crooked. That was when she had found the crossword. She admitted she had written the last word, silence, because it seemed fitting. He loved patterns, she said. He would have wanted it completed. She believed that gesture an act of devotion. I wondered if she realized how close it came to forgery. When she finally fell quiet, the kettle had gone cold. She sat with her hands folded on her lap, the color of them drained by years of careful living. I asked her what Pembroke had confessed that night, what truth she had burned along with the letter. She looked toward the lilies, their scent now sharp, almost medicinal. He wanted to be forgiven, she said, but not by God. By her. I knew whom she meant before she spoke the name. Helena Fane, the novelist, the former pupil who had returned, resurrecting the old wound. Pembroke had meant to tell her something a secret that, if revealed, would have ruined more than his reputation. Evelyn had believed that by ending his pain, she was saving him from disgrace. I did not ask how she had done it. Some kindnesses are too carefully arranged to survive interrogation. When I left, she followed me to the door. She asked if I believed in mercy. I told her that mercy was just another word for memory. It keeps us from forgetting what we'd rather forgive. She didn't answer. Behind her, the lilies glowed faintly in the half-light, their whiteness almost unbearable. Outside, the lane was deserted. The rain had turned to mist, and the chapel bells began to sound the hour, slow, deliberate, unrepentant. I thought of Pembroke's crossword again, of the blank square filled by another hand. Silence, she had written. But there was no silence now, only the steady rhythm of guilt keeping time. The end of term always carries a peculiar quiet, as if Oxford itself were holding its breath, awaiting the departure of the living, while leaving the dead to their echoes. I remember walking through the quad that morning, the frost glinting faintly on the lawns, every stone and archway reflecting a light that seemed borrowed from memory. The college gates were already open, but few students remained who moved with the brisk determination of people eager to leave obligations behind. And yet, the air carried a weight I could not name, an anticipation that was almost reverent. I returned to Pembroke's rooms alone. The desk was unchanged, though the candle stub had melted slightly, leaving a wax halo. The glass of sherry remained where the nurse had placed it. I could see now how meticulous she had been. Each item is a gesture meant to preserve the illusion of order, to shield the world from chaos. The crossword remained half-finished, the last word completed delicately in her hand: silence. That single, small act contained more explanation than words or gestures could hope to provide. I traced the penciled letters with my fingertip and thought of the boy's key, the program, the misquoted Eliot, and the subtle tremor in Helena Fane's voice when she spoke of him. Each clue, each gesture led to the same inevitable conclusion. The end had been guided carefully by someone devoted to Pembroke's memory, and by what they believed was his dignity. Lewis arrived, still wet from the morning mist, carrying a small folder of the final reports. He spoke of arrhythmia, sedatives, the official verdict. I listened, knowing it would satisfy those who only require names and dates. But truth, I knew, was subtler, lived in the silences, in the gestures that fill the spaces between words. I asked him to set the folder aside. This was not a matter for formality. I stood at the window looking across the quad where the remaining students had begun to load their carts. It struck me, as it often does, that human nature is the same regardless of circumstance. Ambition, desire, and petty cruelty continue as long as we walk. Pembroke's death had stirred old patterns, old loves, old loyalties, and had tested them in ways no one could predict. The nurse, the chorister, Helena Fane, Margaret Pembroke, each had played a role, some intentionally, some unwittingly. Their acts were small, almost invisible, yet they carried the weight of consequence. Later I went to the chapel. The organist, Reeves, was playing softly, fingers hesitant over the keys. He did not notice me at first. The hymn was the one Pembroke had composed, unfinished, but now, in some sense, complete. Each note lingered in the vastness of the nave, echoing faintly against stone walls, as if the building itself remembered. I realized then that Pembroke's final act, whatever his intent, whatever mercy or confession it contained, had been preserved in these silences. No one could rewrite it. The corridors were empty when I left. Floorboards creaked under my steps. The faint scent of wax and old paper hung in the air. I remembered the letters burned, the notes rewritten, the words that had been altered, completed, or erased. It occurred to me that Oxford keeps its own counsel, that the city itself has a memory longer than ours. A letter that vanishes may speak as loudly as one preserved and misquoted poet can whisper truth more than a precise citation. I walked back toward my flat, the fog settling like a shawl around the spires and towers. Lewis would follow later, carrying the reassurance of procedure, of paperwork filed, and official statements made. I stayed ahead, alone with the thought that some silences are not empty. They carry information, intent, and at times, mercy. It is in those silences, in the pauses of conversation, the half-completed crossword, the tremor of a hand hovering over a key, that the story of Pembroke's last hours is told most fully. As I reached the edge of the city, the bells of Magdalen tolled once more, low and deliberate. I thought of the nurse, of her careful devotion, of the boy, of the widow, of Helena Fane, each leaving their echo in the lives that remained. Pembroke's life and death had been a measure of human delicacy and error, balanced against the inevitability of time. The bells faded into the distance, leaving behind a quiet, haunting, and inescapable silence at the end of term.